Welcome to Lecture 26. We are beginning Chapter 21, and this then is water, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. And let's begin then with your lecture outline. And notice then when we talk about this idea of balance, we're talking about the fact that the quantities entering the body equal the quantities, and here you can jot down leaving the body. The next sentence then just makes the point that water balance and electrolyte balance are interdependent. And you may just want to jot down here in your notes, when we're talking about these two balances, water and electrolyte balances being interdependent, they are in fact inversely proportional. Anytime one goes up, the other goes down. Anytime one goes down, the other goes up. And it's useful here then to think back to ANP1 when you guys were learning about electrolytes and to remind ourselves just what an electrolyte is. So an electrolyte then is a compound that dissolves in water, and you might want to jot this down in your notes here. An electrolyte then again, just to review, is is a compound rather that dissolves in water to produce ions, to produce charged particles. So again, an electrolyte, a compound that dissolves in water to produce ions. And as we'll see then quite often, the term electrolyte is used to refer to the ions themselves. And so, for example, when we talk about electrolytes, we'll often be talking about things like sodium and potassium and chloride ions. (21.1) then, getting into talking now about the distribution of body fluids. And here what we're learning is that we can, in terms of discussing where fluids within the body are located, we can talk about various so-called fluid compartments. And the initial division then into compartments, and the two largest compartments, notice, are the intracellular fluid compartment, and of course intra implying within. So when we're talking about intracellular fluids, we're talking about fluids that are found within cells. Conversely then, we also have an extracellular fluid compartment. And of course, this would be those parts of the body, that so-called compartment, outside of cells, extracellularly, where we find fluids. And notice then here on your outline, after extracellular fluid compartment, there's a list of 4 basic subdivisions of this extracellular fluid compartment. And the first 3 terms you're familiar with. And so, of course, we've talked about interstitial fluid this semester. You learned about interstitial fluid in ANP1. And here, as a reminder, you might just want to note that interstitial fluid is that fluid that we often call tissue fluid. And then, of course, you guys are also familiar with the fact that plasma, blood plasma, contains fluid. and contains extracellular fluid. If you think about it, lymph also is an extracellular fluid compartment. And then finally, notice here, there's a new term now. So the fourth major extracellular fluid compartment is referred to as transcellular fluid. And indented underneath extracellular fluid compartment. So now specifically talking about transcellular, extracellular fluid, and notice then 5 different types. These are listed for you if you're on page or close to page 806. If you take a look in the lower left-hand corner of page 806, and notice then where the term transcellular fluid is bolded, and immediately afterward then, here are those 5 specific types of transcellular fluid, and you can just jot these down now in your notes, or make a note just to go back and be familiar with these on page 806. But let's mention them then. So transcellular fluid includes, first of all, cerebrospinal fluid. And of course, we've talked about cerebrospinal fluid earlier this semester when we were talking about the central nervous system. The brain and spinal cord, you'll recall, contains cerebrospinal fluid. A second type of transcellular fluid then, notice, is aqueous humor. And a third is vitreous humor. And of course, we've talked about these fluids when we talked about the eye. And then the other 2 types of transcellular fluid you're familiar with from A&P 1. And one of these then is synovial fluid. And the other is serous fluid. Looking now at body fluid composition. And let's take a look. First of all, notice off to the left, you're being directed to page 806 and figure 21.1. And here you'll see then that we have extracellular fluid making up about 37% of total body fluids. And of course, this leaves intracellular fluid making up the remaining 63% of total body fluids. Figure 21.2 then, upper right-hand part of page 806, again shows these percentages. So 63% intracellular, 37% extracellular. And then notice also, and I'd like you to keep this in mind, of that extracellular fluid, the majority of that is interstitial fluid, is tissue fluid. Still talking now about body fluid composition, and let's take a look on page 807 at figure 21.3. So take just a minute and figure out what we're seeing here, what's being presented in figure 21.3. Notice then, going from left to right, we have listed 8 different electrolytes. And then notice on the vertical axis, as we go from bottom to top, we're just looking at progressively higher concentrations. And certainly you don't have to memorize any of these specific concentrations for any of these electrolytes. What I would like you to know is simply for each of these 8 electrolytes, and again going down to the bottom and just running across, notice then we're looking at sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, bicarbonate, HCO3 minus is bicarbonate, phosphate, recall, PO4 with a -3 charge, and sulfate, SO4 with a -2 charge. And back then to what I would like you to know about each of these from this figure is simply which 4 have a higher concentration in extracellular fluid and which 4 of these ions have a higher concentration in intracellular fluid. So take just a minute and figure out how to determine that from the figure. Notice the color-coded key in the upper right-hand part of the figure. Notice above each of the 8 different ions, then there are 2 bars, one showing extracellular fluid composition versus intracellular fluid composition, the bar right next door for each of these ions. And notice then higher in concentration in extracellular fluid, we have sodium and calcium and chloride and bicarbonate, HCO3 minus again. And on the other hand, notice then those ions for which the intracellular bar is higher are potassium, magnesium, phosphate, again the PO4 -3, and sulfate. And we'll stop here with lecture 26.